Well, thank you for having me up here today. I'm excited and very nervous to share with y'all, but I'm just going to start by introducing my family to you. This is me and my husband, Wesley, and then our two boys, Bayer and Isaiah, and our daughter, Aurelia Rose, who went to be with the Lord at 11 months old. Me and Wesley got married in 2020, which was wild decision-making on our part. We got married in June, which was right after the country shut down. We had to replan our lives about 400 times, and finally we ended up getting married on June 1st and headed off on probably the quietest week of the year to the Ozark Forest in Arkansas. There wasn't much to do because everything was shut down. So we drove a four-wheeler up with us so we could go around the Ozarks, we could go hiking, and so that's what we did. Well, about halfway through the week, we decided to go on this hike to find a waterfall. We drove over there, got to the trailhead, and began off and walked about a mile or two before we came to this little creek and this pretty little section where you can see this dripping happening off of a cliff. And I just thought, what a disappointment. Is this really the waterfall I came to see? It's June, my word. And I refused to accept that this was the waterfall. I said, there has to be more. So I started looking for more of a trail, and I did eventually, we found one, and kept walking through this overgrown path until we came to this staircase. And what you can't see in front of that picture is the sign that read, "Go at your own risk, COVID." And we were like looking around, like there's no one here. Are the stairs gonna give us COVID? So we decided to take the risk and walked up those stairs again to this overgrown pathway and kind of wandered on. We were pretty sure we were lost at that point, but at least there was stairs, so we knew we were on the right path. And we get again to this dead end. And I'm like, I refuse to accept this. Absolutely not. We are going to find a waterfall today. And so, again, I'm looking for another spot. And as we're kind of quietly looking around, I hear the sound of rushing water. And like, there is a waterfall. I knew there was a waterfall. And so I'm looking for the trail. I finally find this overgrown path, and I go around the corner, and we find this beautiful waterfall. And there's a creek, and there's lots of people actually sitting there just silently taking in this waterfall. It was just such a serene location, a small waterfall, but so beautiful. The creek kind of came out, and people were sitting on the rocks, so we kind of joined in the quiet and sat down. And while we sat there and we watched this waterfall, I felt the Lord asking me a question. Would you always be willing to follow me through those overgrown and forsaken paths? And of course, I felt like I had this Peter moment because I was like, well, yeah, of course, Lord. Why wouldn't I? Until about 1 month later, when I saw a positive pregnancy test and thought, never mind. I did not know that in that moment, what God was offering me was a life where I would encounter his holiness. And this week, we see the same with Isaiah. Last week, in week 1, we started talking about Isaiah and how he starts telling Israel about the city, the courtroom, and this vineyard. And Amy's summary of it all was that the Israelites were utterly estranged. Meanwhile, Isaiah is having the most magnificent commissioning experience of his life. We start chapter 6, and it begins with a moment that will shape the entirety of Isaiah's ministry and all the words that we study from this point on. Everything he says and does comes back to this encounter with the Lord. So we're going to dive in to Isaiah's commissioning, which has 3 parts. And the first element of it is Isaiah's commissioning is to see God's holiness. In verses 1 through 4, we read, "In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon the throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him stood a seraphim, each had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And the foundations of the threshold shook at the voice of him who called, and the house was filled with smoke." God is holy. His holiness is emphasized as the seraphims are repeating the word holy over and over again, emphasizing this degree of his holiness. We see that he is elevated on a throne, indicating that the Lord is set apart, and that he set apart from the world that he rules over, and that his royal robes indicate this royalty and authority. In Revelations 4:8, we see something very similar, where John says, "And the four living creatures, each of them with 6 wings, are full of eyes all around and within, and day and night they never cease to say, 'Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come.'" His holiness encompasses his moral authority, and his character sets the standard for our character. He is 3 in 1. And God can make Isaiah holy, but he alone is holy, holy, holy. The highest degree of holiness can only be ascribed to him. I was trying to think what could compare in our world and on earth to God and God's holiness. And the only thing, which is very hard since he's set apart and above all and other. And so the only thing I could think of was the sun. So I brought this little quilt my grandmother made for Bear with this beautiful sun on it. And let me change the slide. And I thought about how the sun is so good for us. It warms us. It sets our eternal clocks for night and day. It lets us know when to rest and when to have energy. It gives us vitamin D, and even if we sit in front of a sunrise or a sunset, the red light coming through the atmosphere can actually be healing to our minds and our bodies. But there's another side to the sun, a dangerous side. If you sit too long under its rays, it could burn you. And the closer you get to it, the more intense it becomes and the more all-consuming it will become. And if you decided to fly close to the sun, it would burn you. God's holiness is like this. We even see unbelievers say, "I like God. He has a lot of good ideas, like not to murder, not to lie, not to steal, but I don't know about all the rest." This holiness is scary and it's dangerous. And the beautiful part of it, unlike the sun becoming all-consuming of us and burning us, instead, God's holiness transforms us, and we get to be a part of that sun-like holiness. So we see the Lord. He's elevated and holy, but how does Isaiah respond? This brings us to the second element of Isaiah's cleansing, which is Isaiah's cleansing. In verses 5, it says, Isaiah says, "Woe is me, for I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts." Then one of the seraphim flew to me, having in his hand a burning coal that he had taken with tongs from the altar. And he touched my mouth and said, "Behold, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin is atoned for." Woe is this word of grief and despair, followed by, "For I am lost." He is brought to his finish. He is ruined. He is undone, and his destruction is already complete. Isaiah is lamenting that he is morally unworthy to stand before the King's presence, and his lips, an instrument of praise, have been contaminated by sin. And when the Lord purifies his lips, there's a huge symbolism as Isaiah would go out to speak the Lord's very words for the rest of his life, declaring God's own words to the people around him. This confession is not one of what he's done, but of what he is. Job 42, 5-6 says, "And I heard of you by the hearing of my ear, but now my eyes see you. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes." And then we see Peter having a very similar response in Luke 8:5 when he says, "But when Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, 'Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord.'" This is great news and breaking news because it is just destroying the narrative that the Old Testament is about a God of wrath and the New Testament is a God of love, and instead brings them together in one story with this beautiful picture of judgment and love, and has a beautiful depiction of God's unchanging nature, always offering hope and redemption. Isaiah is made holy in this moment, but this holiness is not like the sun we just described. That can only be ascribed to the Lord. So what Isaiah is actually receiving is imputed holiness or credited righteousness. And I'm very excited to share this example that I came up with. Isaiah is like a sourdough ferment. Any one of you can go home today and take a little bit of flour and a little bit of water and mix them together. And if you breathe air, then you also have wild yeast around you. And that flour wants to be eaten by the wild yeast. So it'll come to your flour and your water, and it will begin eating all of your flour. And soon you'll have a bubbling starter that I just fed this morning, so it's a little bit bubbly right now, but it'll continue to grow and grow. It'll actually double in size every time you feed it and then you can make bread and do all the things. You could give some away, but the idea is that you catch from the air the wild yeast, it eats it, and then it grows and you feed it and it's active and it's bubbling. And in fact, if you've just fed it, if you look a few hours later, you can look down on top of it and you can actually see the flour moving up and down. It's a little wild. And but if you're like, I don't have the time to feed this starter constantly, it's always hungry, it is like another child in my home, then you can say, that's okay, I'm going to put it in the fridge. And if you put it in the fridge, the cold air cools it down, slows the eating process down, and it's still a ferment, but it will actually settle, like you can see in the photo up here. It'll become very flat, not bubbly, and if you leave it there long enough, it'll start developing a sour ferment on top of the flour ferment that's called hooch, and it is gross. And if you take it out of the fridge, you want to dump that out and then start feeding it again, and it'll become bubbling and active again. What this has to do with Isaiah is that Isaiah is an active ferment. He contains God's holiness, something we're all capable of, and the Lord is feeding him his own words, living water, and through prayer, he is having a relationship where he's constantly being fed, he's constantly bubbling over, and he can give that out to other people. Where Israel is dormant in the fridge, they have the holiness of God in them, but they are refusing to use it. This brings us to the third element of Isaiah's commissioning, which is Isaiah's sending, where he says, and I heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send and who will go for us? And then Isaiah said, here I am, send me. This is a declaration of the beginning of his ministry, which starts immediately and just pushes us right into his life after commissioning. God's response to Isaiah's declaration of ministry is this. And he said, go and say to the people this, keep on hearing, but do not understand. Keep on seeing, but do not receive. Make the heart of this people dull and their ears heavy, and blind their eyes, lest they see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their hearts and turn and be healed. The people of God can see and they can hear the Lord, but they are ignoring his holiness. We see starting at the end of chapter 6 and then finally ending in 39 weeks down the road for us, is showing how Israel is a sinful nation, and the Lord wants them to be his servant. He wants to deal with their sin, and he wants them to be cleansed and to trust him. But only Isaiah seems to be willing to take this on. And so this week we talked about how Isaiah begins by approaching King Ahaz, and unlike Isaiah's humble and contrite heart, King Ahaz just rebukes the Lord straight away by saying, and so Isaiah responds to this by saying, hear then, O house of David, is it too little for you to weary men, that you must weary my God also? Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and you shall call his name Emmanuel. He shall eat curds and honey when he knows how to refuse evil and choose the good. Like we talked about this week, this prophecy represents most likely Isaiah's son and Jesus, making it a short-term and long-term prophecy. Someone in study called it today a dual prophecy, which is probably a much better way to phrase it. And then Isaiah again responds a little bit later to the invasion of the Assyrians and the Lord's call to honor him as holy by saying, bind up the testimony, seal the teaching among my disciples. I will wait on the Lord who is hiding his face from the house of Jacob, and I will hope in him. Next we see, and what we ended on this week, was he has a prophecy about Jesus again in Isaiah 9:2 and then 6-7. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in the land of deep darkness, on them a light has shone. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be on his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, and Prince of Peace. Isaiah is willing to see and hear the Lord. He is active. He is speaking to them. He is overspilling with the Lord's holiness. But it is only Isaiah who's willing to see and hear the Lord. The Israelites are encountering God, and they're hearing from him through Isaiah, but they are still ignoring him. Isaiah's life changed in this moment when he sees the Lord seated upon the throne, and the story is awe-filled, and it makes us stop and ponder God's holiness for ourselves. Isaiah was commissioned as a prophet, but today we are commissioned too. We are commissioned as an ambassador of Christ, and we need to do the same things that Isaiah did in these passages if we want to be a living and active sourdough starter in our own lives. We first must acknowledge God's holiness. We are morally unworthy and must be made clean. God's law and his character sets the standard for our character and our moral standards. But I think this is the hardest part, because often to acknowledge God's holiness means that we have to change our entire lives. My husband's one of his closest friends was on the phone with him recently, and in the last year and a half, he had decided that he is not an atheist, and he is interested in what he's calling a higher being. He thinks that people seem happier when they're believers, and he's interested in that, but he doesn't understand why sin is sin. And while I was eavesdropping on this conversation, I thought that Wesley should just lay it out for him, like explain why this is a sin. Like this is clear. This is basic Christianity. You just give him how it is. Like he's right on the cusp. Like he's so close. Let's just force him there, you know? And instead, because I was eavesdropping, I couldn't, put that in my husband's ear. He instead said something entirely different and way wiser than what I would have said, which was, these questions you need to take back to the Lord and wrestle with his holiness. And I just thought, whoa, that is so true. Everything that he is struggling with comes back to the fact that he has not seen a holy God. And so he can't actually see his sin. He is not sitting there like Isaiah, aware that it's not even what he has done, but it is who he is that is morally unworthy to stand there. Which leads us straight to our next point, which is we have to acknowledge our sin. The Israelites and we are like the people that Paul speaks about in Romans, where he says, therefore God gave them up to the lust of their hearts, to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator. We have to acknowledge our sin to be cleansed of it. Charles Spurgeon says, he who tolerates sin in himself or excuses it in others is not a friend of holiness, and therefore not a friend of Christ. About 15 years ago, we were on our way to school, and there was a horrible smell in the car. We could not figure out what it was, and we were searching the whole ride, looking and looking under the seats, around us. What is that smell? Where is it coming from? And meanwhile, my brother, who's kind of a mumbler, is over there in his car seat going, what is that? What is this in my car seat? What is that? And we just kind of ignored him and continued our search to find what was smelling. And finally, we got to the end of our drive, and Ryan puts his little fist down. He was like 3 probably, and he goes, but really, what is this? And we turned, and he pulls out his cup holder, and to this day, we have no idea what the food was, rotting inside his car seat, filled with maggots. It was horrible. We, of course, remove the car seat, have to clean it out. But this story reminds me that our sin stinks. It is awful and it smells, and you do not want to commune with that. And surely God in his holiness does not want to sit in us, and although a perfectly working car, the awful smell of death. But he is willing to cleanse us if we are willing to get rid of it. And so that's what he does for Isaiah, and that's what he's, of course, willing to do for us. And when we are able to do that, we can offer our lives as a living sacrifice. A living sacrifice suffers, but it is from a heart posture of our suffering and understanding God's good and gracious heart that we can go out and encourage and edify the believers and non-believers in our lives. We can say that God hates sin, but In his kindness, his mercies are new each day, offering us new life the moment we desire it. What an awesome and hope-filled life this brings us. We can share that God is good and he is gracious, and he arrives in a broken world and broken circumstances and comforts the broken and crushed hearts. This is a depiction of what sanctification looks like in ceremony and in the mundane. In ceremony, because Isaiah, of course, experiences this all in about 6 verses. He acknowledges God's holiness, he acknowledges his sin, and the Lord purifies him and sends him on his way within minutes, it feels like. But for us, and today, we might not have a big moment. We might not have this true face-to-face encounter with the Lord, but each day when we wake up, we can have the same prayer. Let me see your holiness. Let me acknowledge my own sin, and then allow me to offer my life as a living sacrifice for you today. So back to my literal Isaiah moment. I saw this waterfall, and a month later, I saw a positive pregnancy test. It was not my plan to have a honeymoon baby, to be clear, and I was quite angry about it. And on top of that, then I was so sick, throwing up for the whole entire 40 weeks, only to be induced for high blood pressure, probably because I was angry the entire time, and had a horrible birth. But the first time I held Isaiah, I was in love, and I was absolutely undone by my heart posture and my sin. Undone by the rejection of this beautiful soul the Lord had planted in my womb, and undone by the selfish anger that as I had accused the Lord of not sticking to my plans. It didn't take very long for the Lord to bring Psalms 19:14 to me. Let the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be pleasing in your sight, O Lord, my rock and redeemer. It felt like in this moment the Lord cleansed me and released me of so much guilt and shame. It turned my entire motherhood journey around, as it had begun so low and full of sin, and reminded me that I could still, at any moment, turn around and offer my life as a living sacrifice to him. And so I did. I offered myself and my son back up to him. So, well, I didn't plan this, and I'm clearly not great at this so far. So this is yours. And not much has changed on paper for me when it comes to my actual motherhood journey. It started out rough. My second pregnancy was also miserable, of vomiting for 41 weeks that time. And then 6 months after I had our daughter, I had a miscarriage. And then 3 months post our miscarriage, our daughter transitioned to heaven. Not much changed on paper, but a whole lot changed in my heart in those moments after I had Isaiah. For in the best and the worst of times, I had seen the Lord's holiness. And like a ferment, I had actively seen his holiness giving my broken heart life again and again and again. Daily, he heals and sanctifies me. And I have found that people are rather confused by this. After Aurelia died, one of the most common things, well, actually, first, days after Aurelia had passed, I saw an article on Facebook where someone had commented underneath it. It was about my family. And they said, "This is so sad. This family is destroyed." And I think about Isaiah now when I think about that, because in those moments there was complete destruction. We had been undone. We were finished. We had nothing left, it seemed. But what a beautiful thing that we know the end of the story, that the Lord does not leave us in our complete destruction, but he turns it around and transforms us because he is like the sun. Later, many of the things I often heard was, "You're so strong." And if it was me, I couldn't get out of bed. And the truth was, I wasn't strong, and I didn't want to leave my bed. But over the course of the past 3 years, at that point, I had encountered the Lord's holiness. And I knew that if I didn't get out of bed, it would be like putting myself in the fridge. Death would have won over my life. And like the Israelites, God had presented me with options. Follow me through the overgrown paths, and let's find the waterfalls together. Or let death be the final word. But I wanted hope. And I wanted to see the waterfalls, even if I had to search, because I had seen a holy God, and I want the lives around me to be transformed in the same way. I have found our commissioning ceremony is only the beginning of a bigger story the Lord is working in. He wants to draw us in. He wants us to see and to hear him and be like a ferment, overspilling and overwhelmed by holiness, sharing with everyone we encounter and praying that they too have the eyes and ears to hear what the Lord has to say. And even in suffering, may we always ask the Lord to see his holiness, to reveal our sins, and then be able to go out as a living sacrifice, speaking life over ourselves and to our sphere of influence. And just like Isaiah and so many after him, we can declare the same words he spoke to us this week in the words of our song this morning. I will wait on the Lord, and I will hope in him. For I, who once walked in darkness, have seen a great light. And I, who dwelt in the land of deep darkness, through Christ a light has shone. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. Thank you.